Street Food, Hawkers and the History of London. Fascinating new book about the men, women, boys and girls who hawked oysters, cherries, cabbages and pies on London streets, feeding the capital throughout its transformation from a medieval city to a global metropolis. Delighted to be joining me live on the line from somewhere in the UK, author of Street Food, Charlie Taverner. Charlie, good morning to you.
Morning. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. Whereabouts are you then? Have you just returned from a round selling eel pies in Shoreditch or something? Whereabouts are you today, mate?
Well, I'm in North London, but I haven't been out selling pies or oysters or something like that in the morning, and that's probably a good thing because we're in the low single digits here in London. There's frost on every surface, and if there were still street sellers in London, they'd be having a pretty chilly time.
It's one of the things, isn't it? I suppose because it must have been London 200 years ago, 300-400 years ago, must have been, we talk about bustling, and then we think it's just people walking across London Bridge and enjoying the ice fair, for example, that sort of thing, which would happen at this time of year. But the noise must have been incredible with people saying, because, they could hardly put an advert on their social media feeds, could they, to say, come and buy my beautiful, I don't know, I was going to say melons, but that got me in trouble. Come and buy my oysters or whatever, because, the way that you do it is you'd be shouting out very loudly indeed.
Yeah, it's very hard to imagine now in 21st century London just how busy and full of activity the streets used to be. I mean, we kind of get snatches of it in places where we get food markets and street markets and people gather. And I think actually with the kind of Queen's funeral and everything like that, when everyone was gathering in the streets and in public spaces, was a little bit of flavour of what kind of the old city was like in some ways. Because the streets weren't just a place for traffic and movement; they were places of conversation, socialisation, and also business, everyday business. There's so much buying and selling went on in the streets, so they were full of people, and because there were people and there were produce, they were packed with sensation. There were smells and tastes. You could feel the produce as well. It'd be incredibly stimulating to be in the streets of the city. When
we talk about people selling goods, foodstuffs on the streets of London, were there certain places you couldn't sell in London? Like you couldn't go and, because I would imagine if you were outside, I don't know, Houses of Commons, Palace of St. James, for example, that would be looked on, frowned on, you'd be moved on. Whereas other places, perhaps just across the river over in Lambeth, you'd be able to basically set up on a street corner.
Yeah, it's always been, throughout London's history, when street selling was important, there was always a really delicate balance. Because to be honest, street selling was technically illegal. All the buying and selling in the old city was meant to be taking place in fixed locations, either in shops, brick and mortar shops, or in the formal marketplaces where the city authorities tried to keep all trading. So places like Leadenhall or Covent Garden, places that are familiar with us today. But there were always these people who carried their wares beyond those official places of buying and selling, and they set up shop on street corners, in churchyards, on bridges, places where they knew people were going to be. And because there was this delicate balance in that they were technically illegal, but they were generally allowed to keep on selling, there were these careful arrangements so that if the police or a local set of parishioners decided that they weren't quite happy with trading kind of going on in their particular kind of corner of the city, there was always a risk that they could be moved on. And that was especially true in fancier, kind of leafier kind of bits of town, because the polite residents of those neighbourhoods might be unhappy about the shouts of someone selling walnuts early in the morning when they were trying to have a quiet breakfast.
Indeed, and that still pertains today, probably. But there's a couple of questions then that just come to mind. Presumably, if you were a street vendor, a street hawker, a street trader, whatever, where did you get your produce from? And that was the number one. And B, presumably, because England is a nation of shopkeepers, so therefore they were probably looked on as well by those more static establishments who couldn't suddenly decide to move on and pinch a customer before they even came in.
Yeah, I mean, there is kind of in a hierarchy of kind of retailing in old London, and you did have kind of the shopkeepers with their bricks and mortar shops at kind of one end, and they had their, you know, their big signboards that sway in the wind and kind of, or sometimes glass panes to protect their produce inside their shops. And then you had market traders who might be renting a stall in one of the marketplaces. And then at the bottom of the pile, you had street sellers who, they were still retailers. They were still doing all sorts of trading, and they had their own versions of those trappings. So rather than a solid counter, they might have a fold-up table that they might kind of put on the street. And rather than an advertising board swinging in the air, they had their voices to advertise kind of what they were trading. So there was this kind of hierarchy in status. But what's really interesting is, in practice, all these different sorts of traders, they were part of the same busy business life of the city. So the hawkers had to pick up their produce from somewhere, and that usually was the markets of the city. They went to Covent Garden to stock up with cherries just as they came into season. They went down to Billingsgate, right on the water, to go and collect mackerel and sprats when they were kind of coming into season as well. So there was all sorts of this kind of trading, kind of mingling in together. So while street sellers are often seen as the lowest of the low in some ways, they were just as much an important part of the trading landscape in the city as anyone else.
And I think, you know, we have that current 21st century buzzword, you know, eat fresh, eat local, and eat fresh, and zero food, etc. The meaning it hasn't travelled very far. A couple of things strike me as well. It's got to be seasonal, because you're as you said, going down to the Billingsgate to check what the catch has been. And things like cherries, or, you know, other British fruits. I mean, they're hardly going to be importing avocados now, are they? But they'll be saying, okay, well, it's chestnut season, or it's walnut or whatever. So they would literally be selling what they could, well, what was in season, I suppose, generally.
Yeah, and street sellers were really important for that seasonal perishable produce in particular, because if you're a kind of a shopkeeper with lots of kind of capital, you can invest in imported goods that you can store in your warehouse for long periods of time. But for stuff that goes off quickly, that needs to find customers and get to their tables very rapidly, that's where street sellers come in, because they can move across the city very quickly. And that's important for stuff like fish. It's important for stuff like fresh fruit, but it's also for foods that we might not think of as street food, such as milk. So milk was being produced on the edges of the city. And as we know, if you leave milk out on the side of your kitchen counter unrefrigerated, it goes off pretty quick. So in the age before mechanical refrigeration, there was no choice but to sell that milk very quickly. And street sellers were wonderful at doing that. They brought the milk directly from the fields and barns on the fringes of London, and walked it right into citizens' homes.
Yeah, and that thing, they walked it right on the fringes of London. We forget that the huge metropolis that now is London, which is basically the M25 and all points inwards. But at that point, London has always been a collection of villages. You need to walk around and you'll find, you know, Hampstead is entirely different to Chelsea. You know, Battersea is entirely different to, you know, anywhere else on the planet, basically. But you could find farms, you could find fresh produce within walking distance.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the wonderful things about the history of London before the 20th century is how the countryside and the city blurred in ways that we can't quite comprehend. So to talk about cows, to talk about milk on the edge of the city, you know, in as late as the middle of the 19th century, the height of the Victorian era, there were still 20,000 cows being kept within the boundaries of the county of London. Places that are now important, kind of inner London suburbs, places like Islington. Islington was a really big dairying kind of centre. There was one of the biggest farms in the entire country was here. It was run by a man called Mr. Laycock, whose centre of his business was up by Highbury and Islington Station. Like this agriculture, this peri-urban agriculture, not just for dairy, but for fruit and vegetables, was incredibly important.
One of the things that strikes me as well is that the difficulty perhaps in getting the information, because this is, if you like, the story of street food is an oral history, because these people were too busy working and selling their stuff and to write this all down. And they didn't keep ledgers and notes, etc., as a quote unquote proper business would do. And also, yeah, I mean, we seem to say that, oh well, you know, street vendors, women, men, children. Let's not forget this, because we're talking before any sort of laws like that. So how do you how do you find the information about? How do you get away from the myths of pretty milkmaids and getting all very Oliver Twist? And how did the street hawking or street food sort of question the established narrative of how London developed, if you like?
Yeah, Giles, you're absolutely right. I mean, it is difficult to get at the lives of these people because usually they were talked about rather than given the chance to kind of express exactly kind of what they were doing. So we have different ways as historians of accessing kind of the lives of these more ordinary people. One is to look at those myths and those kind of projections of what people were like. So there's wonderful visual prints, there's music that represents the street life of the city of the past. And what we can do is kind of read those carefully for the little details that they reveal about the kind of the more practical aspects of people's lives. For example, the tools that they were using, the clothes that they were wearing, the kinds of wares they were selling. But more broadly, if we want to get into the nitty-gritty of who these people were, we have to try and find them somewhere in documents. And luckily for us, street sellers and people like them do turn up in places that we wouldn't necessarily expect. So one of the big kind of sets of material that I looked at while I was researching hawking in the past was the records of the Old Bailey. And these are one of wonderful sources. So they are kind of records of criminal trials, essentially from the late 17th century into the early 20th century. And these trials used to be kind of written up and recorded. And when there's a court case, there are all sorts of witnesses called in. They're describing kind of what's going on in and around the case. And those cases often contain lots of wonderful little bits of detail about snatches of city life. And often that might be, someone was escaping, having kind of shot someone or punched someone in the face, and they knocked over a street vendor outside the tavern where this altercation took place. Or a street seller themselves might be called as witness to some kind of crime. So these people appear in all sorts of sources. And one of my kind of tasks was to gather all these little sorts of snippets together and try and build a coherent picture about what they might tell us collectively about the street life of the past.
And so it was vibrant. It was diverse in terms of what the produce they were selling. It was noisy, and was there a sense of? Did you find there was a sense of community amongst street sellers rather than it was every man, woman, and child for themselves?
Yeah, one of the long-term assumptions about street trading is it's quite an individualistic kind of pursuit. And you can imagine it, someone going out there, all they need to do is kind of push their wheelbarrow and kind of call out what they're selling, apples or pears or potatoes or something like that. And they'll go and stand on their street corner and they'll find their customers and then they'll trot home. But then one of the fascinating stories that comes out of the long-term history of trading is actually there's a much kind of stronger sense of kind of common identity between traders. Now, this starts early on that they're fighting for their kind of rights in some ways, and you see groups of traders kind of petitioning the city government for access to the market, for example. But we also know that this would have kind of this collective identity would have expressed itself in softer ways too. So street sellers would have met in the markets when they were picking up produce. They head to Covent Garden in the morning and see lots of other people like them talk about what looked good, what was in season. They're rivals, but they're also kind of colleagues in some ways. And then in the Victorian period, as the numbers of street sellers grow and grow, as the city has expanded massively in all that time, the street sellers develop a very strong sense of collective identity, and it's gathered around this idea of the costermonger in particular. Now, it's a label that may have been invented for them in some ways, but they do eventually embrace it, and costermonger culture becomes incredibly powerful. And there were some kind of wonderful, colourful aspects of that too. Not only were they doing stuff like organizing politically and setting up trade unions, but there was a costermongers donkey show. Costermongers used donkeys to pull their barrows, and then in 1864 someone had the bright idea of exhibiting all these donkeys for the first time at the Agricultural Hall in Islington. And there was not only kind of donkeys being kind of shown around this hall, but there were also donkey racing going around a kind of a circuit in the middle of the building. And later on, another example is there's the Costermongers Sports Day that happened every year, kind of in a warmer season.
Was there a wheelbarrow race? Tell me there was a wheelbarrow race, Charlie.
There was some kart racing. There was some barrow racing, of course. There was also sack races and sprints and all sorts of things. And these kind of events got written up in the newspapers, partly because people at the time saw these as wonderful bits of kind of a slice of life, a bit of colour from the lower class of the city. There's a bit of voyeurism in it too. But I think we can kind of read kind of against the grain to realise, actually, this is a great example of these people kind of pulling together and being proud of their particular tradition.
I suppose the mark of respectability or whatever is the fact when sort of the upper classes start romanticising it, you know, pretty milkmaids, etc., and, you know, honest barrow boys and that sort of thing. Whereas before they would have said, you know, get out of my crescent, get off my square.
Yeah, well, what's interesting is that tension was always there, because street sellers were often complained about. If you look in the records of local parishes, and parishes, let's not forget, were one of the important units of kind of government on a local level before the big boroughs that we have today. You know, people would complain in their neighbourhood about kind of street sellers, you know, blocking the highway, causing a nuisance, having some particularly kind of smelly shellfish that they were selling that someone thought might have gone off. But all throughout that period, we know street sellers were trading and they were being complained about, but they were also being celebrated in popular culture. They were being turned into these caricatures of milkmaids and kind of seductive oyster sellers or innocent fruit girls who might be, you know, fall into sticky situations in the city. So this kind of romanticization, this kind of nostalgic kind of feeling that street selling was there. It's not just something that we all feel today. It was very much present in the past as well, probably as long as street selling was going on.
And now when we talk about street food, of course, the past 10 years has seen the revitalization of street food, but not in the way that, you know, if you had a time machine and you threw a seductive oyster seller through a portal in the time-space continuum, interesting concept, he wouldn't be able to work out what a taco was to begin with, would he? So that sort of urban street food in it kind of look is completely different to the sort of street. I mean, but it's valuable and valid, but it's completely different to the street food that you had, which would presumably be the raw materials to go off or the snack to have whilst you were waiting for your hackney carriage.
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason why I kind of called my book kind of street food is because it brought that instant association with something that we do understand, which is the market stalls and street trading. Kind of, it's trendy, it's often delicious, it's kind of it's a casual way of eating out, basically. That's present in London today, and actually not just London, right across the country and North America, lots of Europe too. But the other thing I think street food brings to mind is the hawking and the street trading in cities right around the world that's still a very important part of people's everyday existence. You know, from places as different, Bangkok in Southeast Asia through to the Philippines, and then even in parts of the rich West, places like Los Angeles and New York City, street trading is a kind of very important part of kind of people's lives. People can pick up kind of food on the street. And what I wanted to try and do was try to connect London with that history in the past, but also with the street trading that kind of goes on around the world today, and say London had that history too. Let's not forget. Interestingly enough, one of the first signs of winter in Spain, or especially down here in Andalusia, is the fact that when it gets cold and the first chestnuts come out, because you have people setting up hot chestnut stalls on the side, on the street corners. And that, for me, is one of the first signs that, to paraphrase a well-known fantasy TV series, the winter is coming. And that is street food, and that is absolutely original, and the whole thing, and it's very, very seasonal. Why did street food in such a way die out? Was it the commercial, was it people moving to the suburbs? Was it people getting proper housing? Was it sort of health and safety? Why did the UK or London in particular, did it just get too big for street trading? Street trading starts dying out in London for a multitude of factors, really. And one of the big changes is in the late Victorian period. The police get much more interested in kind of being strict about how the streets are regulated. They start saying hawkers can't park their barrows wherever they want. Their barrows have to be a particular length and breadth. And one of the changes that happens in the early 20th century is the local authorities are then given power to license all the street trading that goes in within their boundaries. But it's not just a matter of kind of government. There's changes going on in the streets too. And one of the big shifts, we get the first of them appearing on the streets of London in the 1890s, and then very quickly they start taking over, is the motor car. The motor car, the bus, the streets kind of change in character very much. They speed up, and therefore it becomes much more dangerous in some ways for kind of street trading to take place. But there are other shifts too in the way that food is kind of bought and sold too. The big change, of course, that happens is food is being brought over from longer distances, both within the country on the railways and from overseas on ships. And that eventually moves into the rise of the supermarkets. And in the middle of the 20th century, they appear as a big new player on the scene. So for all these different reasons, for the decline of kind of raucous street life, for the changes of traffic and the big shifts in retail that happen, that street trading loses its grip and it loses its special place in the hearts of Londoners.
Is there any item or food item of that was popular back in the day that if it appeared on a street food menu now in a trendy street food market would make people go, blimey, I'm not touching that? Is there anything that made you look at now and go, probably best that we stay away from that one these days and we've moved on?
Whenever I talk about this topic, it's normally the other way around. People are always like, well, what's the thing from the past that you'd like to eat? And I normally have to say, I'm not sure there's loads that I like to eat because, you know, a lot of it's kind of raw food, lots of raw ingredients. And then the kind of the dishes that are ready to eat, they tend to be a bit kind of coarse and kind of crude. Things like kind of pies that you're not quite sure what's in them, sausages that you've no idea how they've been produced. And then also various meats like, you know, baked sheep's heads and cow's feet, which to us, you know, we've got to think a little bit harder about that if that's going to appear on someone's menu. It's a difficult kind of question, really. There's plenty that turns me off in some ways. Once I'd be kind of really interested to try is things like oysters and things that were going to be slipped down kind of very kind of fresh on the streets of the city. Not just because there's something kind of wonderful about that idea that you could kind of eat kind of street snacks and people would shuck them right there and you can have half a dozen on the side of the road, but also the varieties and the tastes of them. I'd be really fascinated to see exactly whether those are things that we're familiar with. You know, are the cherries and apples that people are eating now ones that we can pick up from the supermarket? Are there different varieties? Did they taste as fresh and delicious? Have they got a particular different tang to them?
Yeah, absolutely. Before that, and that's the whole food production is another an hour and a half discussion. But I'm going to run out of time. The book is called Street Food: Hawkers and the History of London. It's by Charlie Taverner, who we're speaking to today. Charlie, if people want to follow you more, are you on the socials? Where can they track you down in the nicest possible way?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at Charlie Taverner. It's very nice and easy. My website with details about the book is charlietaverner.com. And my main work is I work at Trinity College Dublin. I'm part of a big project working on the history of food in Ireland, which is called foodcult.eu. So we do wonderful things like brewing beer and looking at archaeology and exploring
mutual pastime, history of food in the past. That's an absolute mutual pastime, brewing beer and looking at archaeology. The book is called Street Food: Hawkers and the History of London. It's by Charlie Taverner. Charlie, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.